My manager handed my entire 2-year project to a guy who had been at the company for 6 months. He got the promotion I was promised, and when his incompetence burned the whole thing to the ground, they tried to pin every single failure on me. What happened next made me realize that corporate loyalty is the biggest lie we've ever been sold. Before I tell you this story, I need you to do me a quick favor. Smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, and drop a comment telling me, have you ever had credit for your work stolen by someone else? Trust me, you're gonna want to stick around for this one. I need to take you back about 3 years ago. I was working as a senior software developer at a mid-sized tech company. Let's call them Vertex Solutions. It wasn't a startup, but it wasn't a giant corporation either. We had about 400 employees spread across 3 offices, and I was based at the headquarters in Austin, Texas. I'd been with Vertex for 7 years at that point. 7 years of late nights, weekend deployments, and missed family dinners. I'd watched this company grow from a scrappy operation running out of a strip mall office to a legitimate player in the enterprise software space, and I genuinely believed that my loyalty would be rewarded. My manager at the time was a woman named Patricia Chen. Patricia had been my boss for about 4 years, and our relationship was complicated. She wasn't overtly hostile, but she had this way of taking credit for team successes while deflecting blame for failures onto individual contributors. You know the type. The kind of manager who forwards your detailed technical email to executives with a one-line addition that says, as I mentioned in our strategy session, as if they'd thought of it themselves. About 2.5 years before everything fell apart, Patricia called me into her office. It was a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the parking lot. Not exactly a scenic view, but it was a status symbol at Vertex. She had this massive whiteboard covered in flowcharts and sticky notes, and she was practically vibrating with excitement. Marcus, she said, leaning forward in her leather chair, I'm putting you in charge of Project Helios. Project Helios was the company's most ambitious initiative to date, a complete overhaul of our legacy client management system. We're talking about migrating 15 years of accumulated technical debt into a modern cloud-native architecture. This was the kind of project that could make or break careers. I should have seen the warning signs even then. Patricia was handing me a project that everyone else had deemed impossible. The previous 2 attempts had failed spectacularly, burning through budgets and destroying the careers of the developers who led them. But I was ambitious, I was hungry, and I genuinely believed I could pull it off. For the next 22 months, Project Helios became my entire life. I worked 60, sometimes 70-hour weeks. I missed my son's 5th birthday party because we had a critical deployment. My wife and I started sleeping in separate rooms because I'd come home at 2 in the morning and wake her up. The project consumed everything. But you know what? It was working. Against all odds, against every skeptic in the company, I was actually pulling it off. I'd assembled a team of 8 developers, and we created something beautiful. The new system was fast, scalable, and most importantly, it actually worked with our existing client data. By month 20, we were 3 weeks ahead of schedule and under budget. That's when Derek Holloway showed up. Derek had been hired about 6 months earlier as a technical program manager. One of those vague titles that could mean anything or nothing. He was in his late 20s, fresh from a competitor company, and he had this polished, almost rehearsed way of speaking that made everything sound like a TED Talk. I noticed him hovering around our team meetings. He'd show up uninvited, take notes on his tablet, and ask questions that seemed designed more to demonstrate his knowledge than to actually learn anything. Have you considered implementing a microservices mesh architecture? He'd ask, even though we'd already discussed and documented our architectural decisions months ago. At first, I thought he was just eager to learn, maybe even a little insecure about being new. But then I noticed something disturbing. Derek was scheduling one-on-one meetings with Patricia. A lot of them. Sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. And whenever I'd walk past Patricia's office during these meetings, they'd suddenly go quiet. I tried to ignore it. I had a project to finish, and I wasn't going to let office politics distract me. 3 weeks before our planned launch date, Patricia called an emergency meeting. When I walked into the conference room, Derek was already there, sitting at Patricia's right hand with a smile that made my stomach drop. Marcus, Patricia began, and I immediately knew something was wrong from her tone. After careful consideration, we've decided to restructure the leadership of Project Helios. My heart started pounding. Derek will be taking over as project lead for the final phase and launch. You'll be transitioning to a supporting role. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A supporting role? I managed to say. Patricia, I've been leading this project for almost 2 years. We're 3 weeks from launch. The team knows the code base inside and out. Why would you— This decision has been made at the executive level, she interrupted, not meeting my eyes. Derek has extensive experience with high-profile launches, and we feel his leadership will ensure the strongest possible outcome for the company. I looked at Derek, and he had the audacity to shrug apologetically, like this was something that had just happened to him rather than something he'd orchestrated. That's when it clicked. all those meetings with Patricia, all those questions about our architecture. He hadn't been learning, he'd been building a case to take over. I spent the next 3 weeks in a haze of humiliation and rage. Derek immediately started making changes. Not improvements, changes. He replaced our carefully optimized database queries with simpler alternatives that he claimed were more maintainable. He overruled our security protocols because they slowed down development. He scheduled the launch for a Friday afternoon, which anyone with experience knows is the worst possible time for a major deployment. I tried to raise concerns. I sent emails documenting the risks. I requested meetings with Patricia to discuss the technical debt Derek was creating. Every single request was denied or ignored. My team members started coming to me in private, expressing their own concerns, but they were too afraid for their jobs to speak up officially. The launch was a disaster, and I don't use that word lightly. Within 4 hours of going live, the new system had corrupted 6 months of client transaction data. Derek's simpler database queries had created waste conditions that nobody had tested for. By Saturday morning, our biggest client, a Fortune 500 company that represented 30% of our revenue, was threatening to terminate their contract. The entire weekend was chaos. I was called in despite being removed from leadership because I was the only one who understood the original architecture well enough to even begin fixing the problems. I worked 42 hours straight, sleeping in 2-hour increments on the couch in the break room. On Monday morning, Patricia called me into her office. I expected, I don't know what I expected. Maybe an apology, maybe an acknowledgement that I've been right, maybe a discussion about reinstating me as project lead. Instead, she handed me a formal written warning. A written warning? For incredibles. For failure to adequately document system architecture in a way that enabled successful knowledge transfer. She was blaming me for the failure. Me! The person who had been removed from the project against his will. The person who had spent the entire weekend fixing problems I had warned them about. This is insane, I said, my hands shaking as I held the document. I have emails. I have documentation. I told you this would happen. Patricia's face was completely impassive. The executive team has reviewed the situation, and this is their determination. Derek has explained that the original architecture had fundamental flaws that made the transition more difficult than anticipated. And there it was. Derek had thrown me into the bus to save himself, and Patricia was helping him do it. She'd staked her reputation on his leadership, and now she needed a scapegoat. I walked out of that meeting knowing exactly what I had to do. That night, I went home and updated my resume for the first time in 7 years. I reached out to recruiters, I messaged old colleagues who had moved to other companies, but I also did something else. I started compiling every email, every document, every piece of evidence that showed exactly what had happened. Not for a lawsuit, though I consulted with an employment lawyer just in case, but for something more important. I was building a record. 3 weeks later, I accepted a position at a competitor company. A senior architect role with a 20% raise and actual equity. I gave my 2 weeks notice with complete professionalism, documented all of my current work, and offered to help with any transition needs. On my last day, the CEO called an all-hands meeting. This was unusual. We typically only had those quarterly. As I walked into the auditorium, I noticed that Patricia looked pale. Derek wasn't there at all. The CEO announced that Project Helios was being rolled back. The client data corruption had been worse than initially reported. The legal team was now involved. And then he said something that made 7 years of frustration feel almost worth it. We are also announcing some leadership changes, he said. Patricia Chen will be transitioning out of her role, and Derek Holloway is no longer with the company. We will be conducting a full review of how this project was managed. I wish I could tell you I felt triumphant, but mostly I just felt tired and angry. Angry that it had taken a catastrophic failure for anyone to see what I'd been saying all along. Angry that I'd given 7 years of my life to a company that had thrown me away the moment it was convenient. The strangest part? A month after I started my new job, I got a LinkedIn message from one of my old team members. Apparently, the executives had been asking questions about what really happened with Project Helios. They found my emails, my documentation, my warnings. The official narrative was starting to fall apart. It's been 2 years since I left Vertex. My new company promotes based on merit. My manager gives credit where it's due. I'm home for dinner most nights, and I was there for my son's 7th birthday party. Some people told me I should have stayed and fought, that I should have taken Vertex to court or made a bigger scene on my way out. But here's what I've learned. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply building a better life and letting the people who wronged you face the natural consequences of their own decisions. Patricia and Derek didn't fail because I sabotaged them. They failed because they were more focused on politics than on doing good work. And in the end, that kind of failure is inevitable. If you're in a situation like mine, if you're being pushed out, passed over, or blamed for things that aren't your fault, document everything, build your network, and know that your skills have value, even if your current employer doesn't see it. You don't have to accept being treated like you're disposable, because you're not. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything and helps us share more stories like this one. And hey, if you've got your own workplace nightmare that you'd like to share, drop it in the comments or send us a message. Your story could be featured in our next video. Until next time, take care of yourselves out there. You deserve better.